So let's look at the overall structure of the thesis. So the thesis has to contain the following sections. There has to be an introduction, and the introduction will start with a research question and say why it is important, and then give a brief summary of the whole research. It's very important that you start out with stating your research question, because when you reveal your research question right at the top of your thesis, then everything else that you write beneath that will make sense. Everything else will be understood as something working towards answering that research question or arguing why that is a good research question, and so on. If you do not state your research question in the beginning, it can be quite hard for the reader, because the reader will sort of guess, like, where are we going? Why are they writing this? If you start out with a research question, that will frame everything else and make everything else in your thesis understandable. So the literature review is the next section that you have to write. And or actually it's the first section that you'll write, because the introduction is most likely the last thing you will write. The literature review is an argument, and this is really important to understand. The literature review is not you just telling what's in the literature relating to your topic. It is the literature review is an argument for your research question. So it's an argument that has the purpose of showing that your research question is interesting and relevant, and that your research question has not been researched adequately yet. So this is what you need to explain in the literature review. You can structure your literature review in different ways, and I will explain more about that in a later video. But usually it will have different sections. So maybe it will have a quite broad section, then another section that is more specific, and another section that's even more specific to your research question. Or maybe you will have different domains where your research question lie in the intersection of those domains. And what is important is that every section of your literature review, the last paragraph, you can sort of sum up what I have written in this section. How does that further my argument for the relevance and the absence of sufficient knowledge around my research question? In that way, you will keep like a red thread throughout the literature review, and you will remember yourself that you are writing an argument. The next section is the methodology section. And the methodology section has two overall parts. One part is deals with the philosophy. So there you have to clarify your ontology, your epistemology, your research approach, what kind of methods you're using, something about your validity criteria, and so on. So this is like the philosophical background. And the point of this is to show that you have thought these things through, that your research, the kind of question you ask, the methods, that all of this hang together, that it is based on a coherent philosophical research paradigm. Then the next part of the methodology section is what I call the recipe. So you are basically just writing what you did. How did you go about answering the question? A good way of thinking about it is that you are making a recipe that another researcher could follow in order to replicate your study. So the recipe has to contain everything from how you selected your data sources. So where did you find your interviewees? How did you approach them? What did you tell them the study was about? Or maybe you were inviting people to fill in surveys, or you were setting up an experiment, all of these kind of things. It also has to include a detailed description of the procedure for data collection. Like maybe you had interview guides, maybe you developed certain survey questions, maybe you had a sort of a recipe for your experiment. And it has to include your procedures for analyzing the data. how you coded. Did you code the interviews? Did you do meaning condensation? Did you do interpretation? Or if you did something more statistic analysis, did you use t-test, linear regression, factor analysis? What did you do? And you have to think about this as you are giving the recipe so that somebody else would be able to replicate your study. When you write the recipe part of the methodology, you can, of course, follow procedures that's described in literature. For example, if you do interviews, then Steiner Quäle has written a very nice book on interviews where he outlines seven stages of interview. And if you just follow those 7 stages and say exactly what were your choices within each stage, then you have quite a comprehensive recipe. However, you can basically do anything you like as long as you can argue why you did it, as long as you have a good reason for doing it and you can link it back to the research question. So you're not restricted to following any particular method that you find in the literature. You can think about the methodological literature as inspiration. If you want to be on the safe side, you can stick to something that has been described in literature. And if you're a little more adventurous or creative, or if your research question is of a nature that demands it, then you can create your own method as long as you argue why you made the choices you made. The next section is the analysis section. So here you are just presenting your analysis and your findings. I think it's important to say this section is where you are trying to answer the question just from the data. Don't draw in literature in this section. Here you really want to look at your interviews or your surveys or your numbers, whatever, the kind of data you collected. And then you say, this data, when I analyze it, what kind of answers do I find? It's very nice to round off the analysis section with maybe a table or some other more visual representation of the main findings. And when you've done the analysis, then you can look at the analysis and say you will probably have a lot of findings. Depending on what method you have been using, you might have a lot of findings. And think about what are the most important findings, what really stand out for you. If you are more in following like a quantitative method and you have done like, say, hypothesis testing, well, then your findings are just whether or not the hypothesis seems to be correct or not. But if you're doing more qualitative methods, then you've been out talking to people, doing interviews, and they said a lot of interesting things. And then you really have to say, what were the most interesting things? What were the most surprising things? What were the most useful things? Something like this. And so you can round off the analysis section with stating what were your main findings. And this is going to be useful when we get to the discussion, because in the discussion section, you can structure your discussion section by saying, your main findings will be the headings in your discussion section. Now, the discussion section is the section where you are a little bit freer. In the analysis, you're following certain analytical procedures. You are investigating your data, but you are not so free. You're following the procedures, the analytical procedures that you have decided on using. In the discussion, you are freer. You sort of lean back a bit and say, okay, so I had this question, and I know what the literature says about this question. I know the literature doesn't say enough about the question, but it says something about the question. And now I have gone out and I've collected some data and I've analyzed it. And then I also have an answer to my research question from the data. When I compare what the literature says or predicts about my research question, and with what the data says about the research question, what do I see? One way of engaging with the discussion can be to ask yourself the question, where does my research confirm literature? Where does my research extend literature or make it more detailed? And where does my research contradict literature? All of these can be quite interesting. While it might be comfortable when your research confirms literature, it's often more interesting and exciting when it extends it or contradicts it. Now, if your data contradicts what is said in the literature, then you can sort of discuss who's right. Is it, and why is there this contradiction? Is it something about the way that I've collected the data, or is it something about like what were the predictions in the literature based on? Was there something wrong with that? And now I found something more interesting through this research. Or maybe the reason my research contradicts literature is because there's a problem with my research. So these are the kind of discussions that you can have in the discussion section. If in the discussion section you realize that in order to discuss your findings in a good way, you have to refer to literature that isn't in your literature review, then I will suggest that you go back and you rewrite your literature review so that it includes that literature, so that you can refer back to it in the discussion. So this is to say that when you are writing a thesis, you are in a way writing a fictionary tale of the progress of your research. Everybody knows that research is messy. Everybody knows that your research question is revised a ton of times throughout the process. Everybody knows that when you see what you end up finding, then maybe that speaks to slightly different literature than you thought it was going to speak to, and then you go back and you change your literature review, so that in the end you create this fictionary story around how the research was carried out, where the research it appears as if you knew exactly what literature to read and you picked the perfect method from the start, and then you just did your analysis and brilliant findings came out of that spoke to exactly the literature that you wanted to speak to, and then you have a discussion about it. Everybody knows that it's a fiction, and that's fine. It makes it much easier to read when you write it like that, instead of sort of starting to introduce new literature in the discussion and then go, oh, by the way, now I have to explain this thing also. When you're done with your discussion of the sort of empirical findings versus literature, then you can include two more sections in the discussion section. One is about future research. Here you can sort of ask yourself the question, if I were to write a second thesis, what kind of question would I ask? What kind of methods might I want to use? And so on. So you give suggestions to the next researcher. If somebody wants to pick up where you left off, what could you imagine would be interesting to do as the next project? And then it's also nice to have a section where you discuss the practical implications. Remember, your research question was a relevant research question. It was a research question that was important to somebody to have answered. Now you have provided a bit more of an answer for this question. What are the practical implications for the kind of people to whom this research question is relevant? So that is a nice thing to include in the discussion. Then you have to write another section, one on limitations. And limitations is basically where you look at your whole research and then you just criticize it and you write everything that is wrong with it and all the reasons why the answers you found to your research question might be limited or not accurate, and so on. In a later video, I'm going to return to some nice tips about how to structure the limitation section and how to ensure that you have a comprehensive and rigorous reflection on the limitations of your research. And then the last section that you have to write is a conclusion. The conclusion doesn't have to be very long. It is basically just a mirror of the introduction, but shorter. So you just sum up what was your question, how did you go about answering it, what were your main findings, and then see if you can end on some interesting note that has a certain pathos to it. That's always very nice. So yeah, this is the overall structure of the thesis, and now we are going to dig into the individual sections in more detail.